Hey, welcome back to the channel. Sam Visnick here, Release Muscle Therapy. In today's video, we're going to talk about simple strengthening exercises for the psoas muscle. Now, this is a video in a series of videos in which I talk about a lot of different issues when it comes to the psoas, but one of the things that I want to break is the idea or concept that you can't strengthen a muscle, or you should not strengthen a muscle that is in a shortened position. That is not true at all, and I do it all the time. Don't have much of a problem helping people with all sorts of hip and psoas issues. Now, mind you, I hate to make generalizations, so there are circumstances and times where I either wait to do exercises for the psoas muscle or certainly do lots of modifications, whether that's reducing the range of motion, how much loading, and so forth, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. But we should dispel that myth. You need to strengthen muscles that are even in shortened positions. We can strengthen them and simultaneously encourage more length or range of motion as well at the same time. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So one of the primary issues with the psoas, though, is that this muscle, of course, as with most muscles, does not work in isolation. It works with other muscles. So can you really isolate the psoas muscle? Not really. You're really working it with the other hip flexor muscles. So we tend to talk about them as a group. The primary issue we run into with exercises is selecting the right ones for the right intensity. A lot of people with psoas-based issues are either number one, they've got low back issues, or number two, they have pain in the groin inguinal area here in the hip, and oftentimes it's associated with hip impingement or other types of hip issues. Now, as we do those hip flexion activities, bringing that knee up to the chest, get that pinching activity in there or that sensitivity that can linger even after such small doses of exercises. So we need to be mindful of that, and we need to adjust the exercises for that situation until the nerves desensitize, the situation improves, and we can progress to more challenging exercises. Now, if there's a lot of sensitivity in there, I tend to use a supine exercise that trains the hamstrings in order to encourage better positioning of the hip. So be sure to check that video out. I'll link to it below. But in today's video, I'm going to show you about 3 exercises that are super low intensity that I like to use to start working with the psoas that tends to not aggravate it. So the primary reasons that we won't want to aggravate it is too much loading too soon is just going to provoke nerve sensitivity. And if it's already painful in that area, it's just going to cause a flare-up. And then it's going to take longer for the situation to calm down. And of course, it's going to reduce the frequency at which we can exercise the muscle. Those are all bad scenarios. So before beginning any of these types of exercises, just be smart, make sure you get clearance from your healthcare practitioner, talk to them about these exercises and see if they're a good fit for you. Okay, so that's really important. The other piece is make sure that they're done at super low intensity. The most important thing to understand is that pain oftentimes is associated with perceived threat and nerve sensitivity. So we don't have to force strengthening and adaptation responses, i.e. putting too much work on the muscle to try to make it stronger in order to get pain relief. The first thing to do is to be able to perform a repetitive motion over and over again that's low load, low intensity. It reduces fear, threat, and apprehension. So you hear me use that term a lot and say threat-free. The idea is to actually reduce the perceived threat in the area, and that'll allow those nerves to calm down. So that is number one most important concept when it comes to doing exercises for a muscle that is already sensitive. All right? So we're going to dive into these exercises. I'm going to show you all 3 of them here. So let's get started. All right, the first exercise, which is super easy to do and is generally well tolerated, is the supine leg slide. So this exercise is very low loading on the hip flexor musculature, and you're just going to need a couple of things to optimize this setup. Laying on the ground usually works the best. You may need to have an exercise mat or something soft as well, especially if you have tenderness on the spine itself. We want to set up so that we can slide our leg ideally on a carpet, but you could also, of course, use a smooth surface as well, as long as there's not a whole ton of friction. So as a slider, there's a lot of different things. There are these furniture sliders that are oftentimes sold for exercise tools. You could just use a piece of cardboard and it works just as well. But the idea is that the degree of friction that you have running across the surface is going to be the actual resistance. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to put this down on the ground here. I'm going to demo this with the right leg, and I'm just going to put my heel on that. So when I lay on my back, okay, in this position here, my leg weight is being supported on the ground. We're not going to actually use that hip flexor by lifting it off the ground because, as we talked about, that's a pretty good amount of increase in load. So what we want to do before we engage the leg and start doing that piece is something here in the midline. It's ideal to have a co-contraction of the abdominal muscles and the hip flexors at the same time, especially if you have a tendency to arch your back a lot during the movement. So we have a couple of ways to accomplish this. Number one, you can always, of course, flatten your back gently against the ground. Not everybody can completely flatten their back. That's okay. You can put a small towel roll underneath the small of the lower back. You can, of course, stick your hands underneath there as well and gently press the spine down against the hand. By gently pushing that spine down, we want to be engaging the abdominals to do that. So you don't have to smash your abs with a crunching motion. All we have to do is just gently roll that pelvis back a little bit to get that pressure. Now that the abdominal wall is engaged, we pull the heels up on both sides. Now, because we're going to be moving our right leg, we kind of transition our weight a little bit to the left side. So as I do that, I'm going to start to slide my leg out until it is almost straight. The reason why we don't go to straight is because it causes, as it locks, the muscles tend to relax and it causes a jerky motion. So we want this to be a little smoother. So I stop about right there. Now, without my back arching, keeping that abdominal muscle wall engaged, I start to slide that leg back in again. Now, kind of part of the magic here is the angle at which we're starting and stopping. We're not moving into that hip impingement zone, especially if that tends to be a problem. Now, of course, I could come up further, but as I do so, it's going to become more of a hamstring exercise here, trying to curl under, than it is actually loading the psoas. Okay? So as we go outward, we just slide, trying to maintain the control of the abdominals, and then sliding back in. Again, since we're not lifting the leg off of the ground, it's very low load for the hip flexor muscles. Okay? So we would repeat this for a certain amount of time. Most people find this exercise quite easy to do. More than anything else, takes a lot of brain work to try to hold everything still in the core while we're doing that exercise. But oftentimes this exercise can be repeated up for about 2 minutes. That can be done either on one side or it can be done alternating. So I can bring one leg down and then have that piece of cardboard on the other side and then do that one as well. So I'm trying to control pelvic motion as I'm training the muscle. All right, another way that you can strengthen the hip flexor muscles without too much loading or with assistance is by use of a cable. Now, as we talked about, low loading is essential. So for example, if I was laying on my back and lifting the weight of my leg, that is a lot of loading on the psoas. And that can actually be irritating, but at the very least, it's hard to get a sufficient number of training repetitions without irritating the muscle or causing excessive fatigue. So one of the ways that we can deal with this is to do some assistance help loading, right? So in this case, what I have is I have a ankle cuff on that has a little handle on it or notch, and I can lay underneath a cable machine, but you can certainly do this with exercise tubing, especially with a tubing set that has an anchor that will go over the door. So the purpose of this is to actually reduce the weight of the leg and allow for more training repetitions, okay? Good rule of thumb, and I've talked about this previously, I like to have exercises that can be done for approximately 2 minutes, because if it can be done for 2 minutes, usually means it's pretty low intensity. It's a good way to measure, okay? So sitting underneath this, I have a weight on here. It's not too heavy. I always start on the lighter side and of course can graduate the weight downward, thus making the leg do more work. So I'm going to hook that up right here to this cable. It's not too hard since it's right there. It's pretty lightweight. So I'm going to make sure that my leg is positioned directly underneath the cable, ideally, but there's a lot of extra ways that you can set this up if you like. Now from here, what we're going to do is the same as previous exercises. We're going to put the opposite leg up for pelvic support. We're going to add a little bit of abdominal activity by gently flattening the spine just a tad bit to engage the abdominal wall. And from here, the knee can either be straight or it can be slightly bent. Shouldn't make too much of a difference here. And now what's going to happen is the cable machine is going to make my leg lighter. So I am not lifting 100% of the weight of my leg. This can be a confusing feeling at first, especially because the weight is pulling it up a little bit. So my brain is trying to figure out, am I trying to push this down or am I actually trying to lift it up? That's a normal feeling to have during this exercise. That as my leg is going up, I can clearly feel some hip flexor activity, but because I'm getting so much assistance from the cable, It's not hard at all. So I can control and maintain the contraction of the abdominal wall, and I can continue working that leg for the desired amount of time. Usually for most of my clients, I try to aim for up to 2 minutes. Progressively over time, as endurance is built and that nerve sensitivity reduces, we further reduce the weight and make the leg do a little bit more work. But this is an easy way to get some progressive psoas strengthening in an unloaded and a threat-free environment. Okay, so the next one that we can use for low-intensity psoas training is a quadruped. That's where you're on your hands and knees. We can use our slider, in this case, using a carpeted surface and a piece of cardboard, and either cable resistance or tubing resistance. I prefer cable resistance because it's more consistent in terms of loading without having that jerky movement and oftentimes uncoordinated movement activity you tend to get with tubing. So, but again, it will get the job done. So what I'm going to do is I put my ankle cuff around my ankle over here on my left. I'm going to hook up that cable to it. Should be fairly light because remember, our goal is to get a high number of repetitions for reduction in threat and guarding, etc., and to build up some endurance and tolerance in the psoas muscle. So I'm going to get on hands and knees, and then I'm going to put my foot right on that piece of cardboard. I'm actually going to put that cable on the inside here. So on hands and knees, we want to get a little bit of abdominal activity. Very easy to do here. All we need to do is to tuck our tail just a little tiny bit, and we can shift our weight forward, which tends to recruit more abdominal muscles. I'm going to shift my weight to my left knee. That's the opposite side of the working leg. And all I'm going to do here is just allow my leg to slide back. Now, very important here to understand that my weight is down against the ground. I'm just letting gravity do the work there. Okay, I'm not actually trying to lift my leg up off the ground. Now, we're going to maintain the position, and all we're going to do is just slide that leg up. Now, you're only going to go as high into hip flexion. That's the bend here of the hip as tolerated. But even oftentimes in impingement syndromes, this position is far better tolerated than other ones. So here, even if the movement is very short, that is okay, because that will allow for proper conditioning of the muscle without excessive threat or discomfort. So I would continue that for the recommended number of repetitions. I love oftentimes doing 2 minutes because that means it's fairly low intensity. And if anything, the fatigue should really be on the opposite leg by supporting you. So it's going to give some work to that side. If there's issues with the wrist, discomfort, we can oftentimes go down to the elbows here. And in my office, I'll put something up higher so it's a little bit more comfortable, but this is a doable option as well. Okay. So again, another great exercise, more in line with progression, adding more bodily activities and positions to eventually get upright for that low intensity psoas conditioning. All right, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up, comment down below any questions you might have, and of course, subscribe to the channel. I've also included a link down below for my Psoas program, so be sure to get on the notification list if it's not live yet. If it is live yet, of course, be sure to check out the program, get access for a complete A to Z approach for dealing with ongoing psoas issues. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.